The morning shift at the Galactic Communication Hub began like any other. Radio operator Lisa monitored 17 different alien frequencies while sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The massive receivers picked up everything from Alterian poetry broadcasts to roughback military drills. Then, at exactly 0347 Standard Time, every single channel went silent. Lisa checked her equipment twice before the first distress signal came through. It arrived as a broken transmission from the Alterian homeworld, their usually melodic language reduced to confused stammering. The speaker kept repeating the same phrase over and over, asking who they were and where they lived. Within minutes, similar calls flooded in from across the galaxy. Something had swept through space like an invisible storm, leaving chaos in its wake. The proud Alterian scholars who could recite 10,000 years of history suddenly stared at their own books as if seeing alien script. Roughback warriors forgot their battle codes and sat confused in their war halls. Even the synthetic minds of the network went quiet, their vast databases apparently wiped clean. Earth felt it too. At 0351, every human on the planet experienced the same moment of disconnection. Memories flickered like dying lights. Names became unfamiliar sounds. For 3 terrifying seconds, humanity teetered on the edge of the same abyss that had swallowed the rest of the galaxy. Then something remarkable happened. The memories snapped back. Dr. Sarah Chen was analyzing stellar data when the wave hit her research station. One moment she knew exactly who she was and what she was doing. The next, she found herself staring at equipment she couldn't identify, surrounded by faces that meant nothing. But before panic could set in, everything returned with startling clarity. Her name, her work, her childhood on Mars colony, it all came rushing back like water filling a broken dam. Reports poured in from across human space. The same pattern repeated everywhere. A brief moment of total confusion, then rapid recovery. While alien civilizations collapsed into bewildered chaos, humanity shook off the attack like a bad dream. Admiral Rex Thompson received the first alien distress calls at Luna Command. The grizzled veteran had seen 3 wars and countless diplomatic crises, but nothing like this. Alterian patrol, ships drifted helplessly through space, their crews unable to remember how to operate basic systems. Roughback mining platforms went dark as workers forgot how to maintain life support. Entire planets fell silent. The Admiralty called an emergency session. Around the holographic conference table, Earth's military leaders tried to understand what had happened. The weapon that struck them left no physical damage, no energy signatures, nothing but empty minds across half the galaxy. Only humanity seemed immune. Dr. Chen presented her preliminary findings to the Council. Brain scans of humans who experienced the memory loss showed unusual neural activity in regions associated with trauma recovery. It was as if their minds had instantly begun rebuilding damaged pathways, rerouting around areas that had been somehow severed from conscious access. The human brain is messy, she explained, projecting neural maps onto the conference room walls. Millions of years of evolution left us with redundant systems, backup pathways, and connections that serve no obvious purpose. Most species developed cleaner, more efficient mental architecture, but our chaos might have saved us. The implications were staggering. Earth had become the only civilization in the galaxy with intact memories. They alone remembered the old treaties, the established borders, the careful balance of power that had kept the peace for centuries. Every alien species now depended on humanity's word to understand their own place in the universe. Admiral Rex studied reports from scout ships sent to nearby systems. The Alterian capital world was descending into chaos as a population of billions tried to relearn basic survival. Roughback mining colonies had shut down completely when workers forgot how to operate excavation equipment. Trade routes that had functioned for millennia now sat empty. But Earth's merchants were already moving. Human cargo ships appeared in alien systems, offering food, medical supplies, and basic technology to populations that could no longer care for themselves. Some came with genuine humanitarian intentions. Others saw opportunity in the greatest power vacuum in galactic history. The first reports of exploitation reached Luna Command within days. Human traders were claiming ancient alien mining rights that no one else remembered signing. Protection companies offered security services to governments that couldn't recall their own military protocols. A few rogue human settlements had simply declared themselves rulers of entire star systems, knowing that local populations lacked the memories to challenge their authority. Rex found himself facing an impossible situation. Earth could help rebuild galactic civilization, but doing so would make humanity the unwilling puppet masters of every other species. They would have to decide which memories to restore, which borders to recognize, which leaders to support. Every choice would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. Intelligence reports suggested that several human factions were already planning to exploit the crisis. Corporate interests wanted to claim resource-rich systems whose inhabitants couldn't remember owning them. Military hardliners argued for establishing human dominance while resistance was impossible. Even well-meaning humanitarian groups faced the problem of imposing their own values on cultures they were trying to save. The moral weight of the situation pressed down on everyone involved. Earth held the memories of 1,000 civilizations in trust, but using that knowledge would mean becoming the arbiters of galactic justice. Not using it would mean watching advanced societies collapse into primitive chaos. Rex spent long hours studying historical records, trying to find precedent for such a decision, but human history offered no guidance for becoming the sole guardians of galactic memory. Every choice seemed to lead to either tyranny or tragedy. As reports continued flooding in from across space, one pattern became clear. The memory weapon had been incredibly precise, targeting only conscious recall while leaving basic motor functions and survival instincts intact. This wasn't random destruction but surgical removal of everything that made a civilization capable of complex thought. Someone or something had deliberately reset the galaxy's mind. The question that kept Rex awake at night was simple but terrifying. What kind of enemy would consider universal amnesia a weapon of choice? And more importantly, were they finished? Or was this just the beginning? The stars still burned in their ancient patterns, but the civilizations that had named them were gone. Only Earth remembered what those names meant, and the weight of that knowledge was almost too heavy to bear. 3 months after the galaxy forgot itself, Dr. Maya Singh stood in her laboratory on New Geneva Station, staring at brain scans that defied everything she knew about neuroscience. The Alterian volunteer lying in the medical pod had been one of their greatest philosophers before the memory attack. Now he couldn't remember his own species' name, let alone the complex theories that had made him famous across 12 star systems. Maya had been studying the effects of the memory weapon since the first victims arrived on Earth ships seeking help. What she discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness itself. The weapon didn't destroy memories so much as sever the pathways that allowed minds to access them. The information was still there, locked away behind neural barriers that most species couldn't overcome. But humans were different. Their brains, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary struggle, had developed redundant systems and backup pathways that other species lacked. When the memory weapon struck, human minds immediately began rerouting around the damage, rebuilding connections through alternate neural channels. It was messy, inefficient, and often painful, but it worked. Thaine. Refugee camps on Luna told the story of galactic collapse in heartbreaking detail. Alterian artists sat staring at their own masterpieces, unable to remember creating them. Roughback engineers couldn't operate the machines they had designed. Families were separated not by distance, but by the inability to recognize each other's faces. Children called out for parents who looked at them like strangers. Earth's response had been swift but complicated. Humanitarian aid flowed to every affected system, but it came with strings attached. Human administrators made decisions about resource distribution, territorial boundaries, and governmental structure. They had to, because no one else remembered how these things had worked before. The moral burden was crushing Admiral Rex and his staff. Every day brought impossible choices. When the Alterian colonies couldn't remember which planets they owned, Earth's colonial office had to decide based on incomplete records. When roughback clans forgot their ancient territorial agreements, human mediators drew new boundaries that satisfied no one but kept the peace. Some humans embraced their new role as galactic caretakers. Others saw opportunity in the chaos. Corporate expeditions claimed mineral rights on worlds whose inhabitants couldn't remember previous ownership. Human settlements expanded into territories that had been off-limits for centuries. A few charismatic leaders declared themselves rulers of entire systems, knowing that local populations lacked the memories to challenge their authority. Maya's research offered a glimmer of hope. She had identified the specific neural patterns created by the memory weapon and developed techniques to stimulate the formation of new pathways around the damaged areas. The process was slow and often incomplete, but some subjects were beginning to recover fragments of their past. The first, successful treatment was performed on a young Alterian named Del, barely past adolescence when the attack occurred. Under Maya's guidance, his brain began reconnecting to memories of his childhood, his family, and his education. But the recovered memories came back changed, filtered through the trauma of losing them. Del remembered his parents but couldn't feel the emotional connection those memories should have carried. News of the breakthrough spread quickly, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Should Earth attempt to restore alien memories when the recovered information might be incomplete or distorted? Did humanity have the right to decide which memories were worth preserving and which should remain lost? The political implications were staggering. Restoring memories meant restoring old grievances, territorial disputes, and racial tensions that had kept the galaxy in a state of constant low-level conflict for millennia. Many of the refugees seemed happier without the burden of historical hatred. They formed new communities based on immediate needs rather than ancient prejudices. Rex found himself caught between competing pressures. The humanitarian lobby demanded that Earth do everything possible to restore alien minds to their former state. Military advisors warned that returning old memories would also return old enemies, potentially creating conflicts that humanity would be forced to mediate. Corporate interests wanted to maintain the status quo that allowed human expansion into previously restricted territories. Intelligence reports painted a disturbing picture of humanity's growing influence. On 17 worlds, human administrators had become de facto governors because no one else remembered how to run complex societies. Trade networks that had operated for centuries now depended entirely on human memory to function. Even basic diplomatic protocols required human interpretation. The refugee camps themselves became laboratories for social experimentation. Without the constraints of previous cultural identities, alien populations began developing new forms of organization. Alterians who had been rigidly hierarchical before the memory loss formed democratic councils. Roughbacks who had lived in constant tribal warfare organized themselves into peaceful cooperatives. Maya watched these developments with growing unease. Her medical training told her to restore patients to their previous state, but her observations suggested that some of them might be better off without their old memories. The galaxy had been locked in patterns of conflict for so long that amnesia might actually be a form of healing. The moral complexity of the situation was unprecedented in human history. Earth had never faced the responsibility of deciding the mental fate of entire civilizations. Every choice carried enormous consequences that would echo across generations. Restoring memories preserved cultural heritage, but might also restore destructive patterns of behavior. Leaving minds blank protected against old hatreds but destroyed irreplaceable knowledge and identity. Reports from the outer colonies added another layer of complexity. Some human settlements had begun integrating memoryless aliens into their communities as equals, creating hybrid societies that had never existed before. These experiments in multiculturalism were largely successful, but they depended on the aliens' continued inability to remember their former status and relationships. Maya prepared for her next round of experiments. She couldn't shake the feeling that humanity was being tested. The memory weapon had been too precise, too surgical to be a random attack. Someone or something had deliberately created this situation, and Earth's response would determine not just the fate of the galaxy, but perhaps humanity's place in it. The weight of universal remembrance was proving heavier than anyone had imagined. Earth held the memories of 1,000 civilizations in trust, but using that knowledge meant becoming the arbiters of galactic justice. The question that haunted Maya's dreams was simple but profound. What gave humanity the right to decide what the galaxy should remember? The crystal spires of Alteria Prime rose like frozen music from the planet's surface, their surfaces still catching sunlight in patterns that had inspired poets for 10,000 years. But the streets below lay empty except for confused figures, wandering aimlessly through a city they could no longer understand. Captain Tom Bradley watched from his transport's viewport as they descended toward the former capital of galactic civilization. His relief mission carried food synthesizers, medical, supplies, and basic computing devices that might help the Alterians relearn how to live in their own world. But as the ship settled onto a landing pad that activated automatically despite its operators being long gone, Tom realized the true scope of what had been lost. This wasn't just a city, or even a planet. This was the cultural heart of the galaxy, and it had been lobotomized. The Alterian who met them at the spaceport wore robes that marked him as a high official, though he introduced himself simply as someone who thinks he might have been important once. He spoke in broken fragments of his own language mixed with universal standard, as if his tongue had forgotten how to form the elegant phrases that had made Alterian poetry famous across known space. Tom's team set up aid stations in what had been government buildings. The architecture was stunning even in abandonment, with halls designed to amplify the harmonic vibrations of Alterian speech and chambers where crystal formations created natural acoustic effects. But the beings who wandered through these spaces seemed diminished by their grandeur, like children lost in a museum they couldn't comprehend. While his medics treated malnutrition and basic injuries, Tom explored the deeper levels of the capital complex. His scanner detected massive energy signatures beneath the main administrative tower. Following the readings led him through increasingly sophisticated security systems that still functioned despite their creator's amnesia. At the lowest level, he found something that changed everything. The memory vault stretched for kilometers beneath the city's foundation. Crystalline storage matrices lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one glowing with the soft light that indicated active data storage. The chamber's environmental systems maintained perfect preservation conditions, and automated guardians still patrolled the corridors, even though no one remembered what they were protecting. Tom's portable analyzer confirmed what he hardly dared believe. The crystals contained complete historical records not just of Alterian civilization, but of dozens of species across the galaxy. Cultural databases, governmental archives, scientific discoveries, artistic works, and detailed biographical information on billions of individuals. Everything that the memory weapon had stolen from conscious minds was stored here in perfect detail. The discovery changed the equation entirely. Earth didn't just hold fragments of galactic memory in human minds. Here was the complete archive of galactic civilization, preserved against exactly this kind of catastrophe. But accessing it would require making the same impossible choices that had been haunting Earth's leaders for months, only now with perfect information, instead of fragmentary recollections. As Tom documented his findings, his communication system activated with an incoming message from deep space. The transmission used frequencies and protocols that hadn't been employed in the galaxy for centuries, suggesting a source older than any current civilization. The voice that emerged spoke universal standard with an accent that seemed to come from the language's ancient roots. "I am the curator," the voice said without preamble. "I have been waiting for someone to find the memory vaults. I assume you are human, since no other species has retained sufficient cognitive function to navigate the security systems." Tom activated his recorder and tried to trace the signal's origin, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who are you? What happened to the galaxy?" "I am the last guardian of a cycle that has repeated itself 6 times in galactic history," the curator replied. "Every few million years, the accumulated weight of hatred, prejudice, and historical grievance reaches critical mass. Wars escalate beyond any possibility of resolution. Entire species dedicate themselves to the extinction of their enemies. The galaxy burns itself to ash in conflicts that began with disputes no one alive can even remember. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. You did this, you caused the memory loss. I activated the Void Echo Network, yes. It was designed by my people as a final solution to the cycle of galactic self-destruction. When civilizations become so locked into patterns of hatred that peace becomes impossible, the network resets their minds, gives them a chance to start fresh without the burden of historical grievance. Tom's team continued working in the city, above while he argued with an entity that claimed responsibility for lobotomizing half the galaxy. But you destroyed everything. Art, science, culture, individual identity. All of it is gone. Nothing is destroyed, the curator corrected. It is preserved in vaults like the one you have discovered. Every previous cycle has eventually chosen to restore their memories, and every time they repeat the same patterns of conflict. They rebuild their civilizations, they rediscover their old hatreds, and within a few thousand years they are back to preparing for total war. The crystal storage around Tom suddenly seemed less like salvation and more like a trap. What about the species that don't recover, the ones who can't rebuild their memories? They adapt or they fade away. That is the price of breaking the cycle. Some knowledge is lost in exchange for the possibility of genuine peace. Your species presents an interesting variable. You have retained your memories while everyone else lost theirs. You could guide the galaxy toward a different outcome. Tom realized he was being offered a choice that would affect trillions of lives. And if we restore the memories from these vaults, then you condemn the galaxy to repeat its ancient cycle of hatred. The Alterians will remember their territorial disputes with the Roughbacks. The machine civilizations will recall their fear of organic intelligence. Every species will reconstruct the prejudices and grievances that brought them to the brink of universal war. The weight of decision pressed down on Tom as he considered the sleeping city above. The Alterians wandering its streets seemed lost and diminished, but they also seemed peaceful. Children who couldn't remember racial differences played together. Adults who had forgotten ancient grudges helped each other with basic survival. The galaxy's amnesia had created something unprecedented, universal cooperation born from universal ignorance. But it had also created a humanitarian crisis on an unimaginable scale. Billions of beings had lost not just their memories but their sense of identity, their connection to family and community, their understanding of their place in the universe. They survived. But could it really be called living? As Tom prepared to leave the memory vault, the curator made one final statement. You have 30 days to decide. Either help guide the galaxy toward a future without its destructive past, or I will activate the final pulse. This one will be powerful enough to overcome even human neural redundancy. The choice is yours, but the cycle ends now, one way or another. The transmission cut off, leaving Tom alone with the greatest repository of knowledge in galactic history and a deadline that would determine the fate of every conscious mind in known space. Above him, the spires of Alteria Prime continued, their silent song, but now he wondered if anyone would ever remember the lyrics again. The ancient station hung in the galactic core like a metallic spiderweb, its structures stretching across space in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Admiral Rex studied the long-range sensor data from his flagship's bridge, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of what they had found. The curator's base was older than human civilization, older than most of the galaxy's current species, and it pulsed with energy signatures that made their most advanced technology look like stone tools. Dr. Maya Singh worked frantically in her mobile laboratory, surrounded by the best minds Earth could assemble on short notice. The deadline was 18 days away, and they still had no solution that didn't involve either abandoning billions to continued amnesia or condemning the galaxy to repeat its ancient cycles of warfare. Her latest experiments with selective memory restoration showed promise, but the techniques were untested on a galactic scale. The curator had been remarkably forthcoming about its history and motivations during the daily communication sessions. It claimed to be the fusion of organic and synthetic consciousness, the last survivor of a species that had transcended individual identity millions of years ago. Its people had watched the galaxy destroy itself 5 times before developing the Void Echo Network as a final solution to the problem of perpetual conflict. Your species fascinates me, The curator's voice echoed through the communication chamber. Every previous iteration of galactic civilization chose to restore their memories when faced with this decision. They valued their cultural identity more than lasting peace. But humans seemed to process the choice differently. Rex had been studying the historical records that Tom found on Alteria Prime. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Civilizations would flourish for thousands of years, developing art, science, and philosophy to incredible heights. But eventually, old grievances would resurface. Territorial disputes would escalate into sector-wide conflicts. Racial prejudices would harden into policies of systematic oppression. The galaxy would slide inexorably toward total war. "You're asking us to play God with the minds of trillions of beings," Rex said. "How is that different from what you've already done?" "The difference is choice," the curator replied. "I am offering humanity the chance to guide the galaxy's recovery, rather than simply restoring the status quo. You could help other species rebuild their identities without the destructive elements that led to conflict. You could be the shepherds of a genuinely peaceful galactic civilization." But Maya's research suggested that the process wasn't that simple. Memory and identity were too interconnected to separate cleanly. The personality traits that led to territorial aggression were often the same ones that inspired artistic creativity. The cultural pride that fueled warfare was also what motivated scientific achievement. Trying to edit out the negative aspects of consciousness might destroy the positive ones as well. Reports from Earth's colonies painted a complex picture of the experiment already underway. Human settlements that had integrated memoryless aliens were showing remarkable success in creating peaceful cooperative societies, but they were also losing the cultural diversity that had made galactic civilization so rich. Alterians were forgetting their musical traditions. Roughbacks were abandoning their oral histories. The network's synthetic consciousness was simplifying into basic functionality. The most disturbing reports came from the Outer Rim, where some human groups had taken the curator's offer to heart and begun actively preventing alien memory recovery. They argued that maintaining the amnesia was the only way to ensure lasting peace, but their methods bordered on mind control. Entire populations were being kept in a state of induced ignorance for their own supposed benefit. Rex realized that the curator's deadline was forcing humanity to confront its own nature. Earth had always prided itself on valuing diversity, freedom, and individual choice, but those values were meaningless if they could only exist in the absence of memory and identity. The question wasn't whether to restore the galaxy's memories, but whether humanity could find a way to preserve peace without sacrificing consciousness itself. Maya's breakthrough came during her 15th day of continuous research. Her team had been studying the neural patterns of humans who had experienced the memory weapon, and they discovered something remarkable. The human brain's chaotic architecture didn't just allow for redundant memory storage. It also created natural filters that could distinguish between different types of information. "We can separate episodic memories from emotional associations," Maya explained to the assembled command staff. Aliens could remember their history without feeling the full, emotional impact of old grievances. They would know about past conflicts without being driven to repeat them. The technique required unprecedented cooperation between human technology and alien neural architecture. Earth scientists would need direct access to the consciousness of volunteers from every affected species. But if it worked, the galaxy could recover its cultural heritage without inheriting its destructive impulses. Rex began reaching out to the few alien individuals who had shown signs of natural memory recovery. Most were young, their minds more adaptable than older survivors. They formed the core of a multi-species task force dedicated to testing Maya's protocols before the curator's patience ran out. The first test subject was Del, the young Alterian, who had partially recovered under Maya's earlier treatment. The procedure required him to interface directly with human technology, while Maya's team carefully stimulated specific neural pathways. The process was exhausting and sometimes painful, but gradually Del began to remember his people's history, without the crushing weight of ancient hatreds. "I remember the border wars," Del said afterward, his voice filled with wonder. "But I understand them as historical events, not personal grievances. I can see how fear and misunderstanding led to conflict without feeling compelled to continue. At word of the successful treatment spread quickly through the refugee communities. Volunteers came forward from every affected species, eager to reclaim their identities without losing the peace they had found in amnesia. But the process was slow and required enormous resources. Treating the entire galaxy would take decades, assuming the curator would allow it. With only 3 days remaining before the deadline, Rex made his decision. He couldn't guarantee that Maya's technique would work on a galactic scale, but he could guarantee that the curator's final pulse would destroy everything that made consciousness valuable. Earth would fight for the right to remember, even if those memories included pain. The final confrontation wouldn't be fought with weapons, but with the power of human consciousness itself. Maya's team had developed neural interface technology that could project human thoughts directly into the Void Echo network. If they could reach the curator's station and interface with its ancient systems, they might be able to reprogram the network to support selective memory restoration instead of total amnesia. As Rex's fleet prepared to enter the galactic core, he wondered if humanity was about to make the same mistake as every previous civilization. But unlike those who had come before, Earth had learned to value the act of remembering itself, not just the content of memories. They were fighting not just to restore the past, but to prove that consciousness could grow beyond its own limitations. The stars ahead burned with the light of the galaxy's ancient heart, and somewhere among them waited an entity that had spent millions of years trying to solve the puzzle of lasting peace. Soon they would discover whether humanity's chaotic approach to consciousness could succeed where perfect logic had failed. The neural interface chamber aboard the flagship resembled nothing so much as a technological shrine, its walls lined with equipment that blurred the boundaries between science and mysticism. 12 volunteers from humanity's finest lay connected to machines that would project their consciousness directly into the Void Echo network. Admiral Rex checked each connection personally, knowing that the people in these pods were about to fight the strangest battle in human history. Dr. Maya Singh monitored the brain patterns of each volunteer as they prepared for neural projection. The readings showed unusual activity in regions associated with memory formation and emotional processing. The volunteers weren't just preparing to enter a computer network. They were getting ready to dive into the collective unconscious of galactic civilization itself. The curator's station loomed on their view screens, its impossible architecture stretching across space in patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. Energy readings indicated that the final memory pulse was charging, building toward a release that would reduce every conscious mind in the galaxy to blank emptiness. Rex had perhaps hours before the ancient entity carried out its ultimate threat. Beginning neural projection in 3 minutes, Maya announced. Her voice carried the tension of someone who knew they were attempting something that had never been tried before. The interface technology was untested, the target was hostile, and failure would mean the end of consciousness as they knew it. Rex himself was among the volunteers. At 63, he was older than optimal for neural projection, but his decades of command experience made him uniquely qualified to lead a mission into enemy mind space. As the connection activated, reality dissolved around him and he found himself floating in a realm where thoughts took physical form. The Void Echo network manifested as an endless library filled with the memories of dead civilizations. Towering, shelves stretched into infinity, each one containing the complete mental archives of species that had risen and fallen over millions of years. The very air seemed thick with accumulated grief, the weight of countless conflicts that had led to galactic destruction. Rex and his team advanced through the library as a unit, their consciousness maintaining coherent form through sheer force of will. They encountered the curator's defenses immediately. Phantom warriors materialized from the shadows, each one representing a moment of historical violence. Alterian soldiers, from ancient border wars charged with crystal weapons. Roughback berserkers howled battle songs from forgotten campaigns. Network combat units fired energy beams that existed only in memory, but could still destroy a projected mind. But the human volunteers held their ground with something the phantom armies lacked: the knowledge that violence was a choice, not an inevitability. They had studied their own species' history of warfare, and learned to see conflict as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted. When the ghostly warriors struck, the humans absorbed the attacks and transformed them into understanding. The curator itself appeared as they reached the library's central chamber. It was a being of pure consciousness wrapped in the accumulated despair of millions of years. Its form shifted constantly, sometimes appearing as a towering figure of shadow and sometimes as a swirling vortex of dark energy. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of every civilization that had destroyed itself in meaningless conflict. "You have come to repeat the same mistake as all the others," the curator said. "You believe that consciousness can change, that beings can learn from their mistakes and choose differently. I have watched this delusion play out across 6 cycles of galactic history. Every time they restore their memories, and within a few millennia they are preparing for total war." Rex stepped forward, his projected form solid with conviction. "Maybe they failed because they tried to forget their mistakes instead of learning from them. You've been offering the galaxy a choice between memory and peace, but those aren't opposites. They're partners." The curator responded with a wave of psychic force that should have shattered the human minds like glass. Instead, the volunteers absorbed the attack and reflected it back as something entirely different. They showed the ancient entity visions from human history, the wars, the genocides, the countless moments when Earth had teetered on the edge of self-destruction. But they also showed the slow, painful progress toward something better. "We remember the Holocaust, and we chose to build institutions to prevent it from happening again," Rex said, his words carrying the weight of historical truth. "We remember slavery, and we fought a civil war to end it. We remember the nuclear weapons, and we stepped back from the brink of mutual destruction. Memory isn't what causes conflict. Refusing to learn from memory is what causes conflict." The curator recoiled, as if struck. For the first time in millions of years, it was experiencing a perspective it had never considered. The human volunteers pressed their advantage, surrounding the ancient entity with their memories of growth, change, and genuine transformation. They showed how consciousness could evolve beyond its initial programming. "You're offering the galaxy the choice between ignorance and repetition." Maya's voice joined the mental battle. "But there's a third option. We can remember everything and choose to do better. We can honor the past without being enslaved by it." The battle shifted from one of force to one of ideas. The curator threw the accumulated despair of galactic history at the human minds, showing them every atrocity, every moment of hatred, every decision that had led civilizations toward destruction. But instead of breaking under the weight of universal suffering, the humans transformed it into compassion. They didn't deny the darkness of consciousness or pretend that sentient beings were naturally good. They acknowledged every flaw, every destructive impulse, every moment when fear had triumphed over wisdom. But they also demonstrated humanity's most fundamental insight, that the ability to make mistakes was also the ability to learn from them. The curator's form began to change. The shadow and darkness that had defined it for millions of years started to give way to something else. For the first time since its civilization had transcended individual identity, it experienced something new. Hope. "Show me how it could work," the curator said, its voice no longer carrying the weight of universal despair. "Show me how consciousness can grow beyond its limitations." Rex and his team worked together to reprogram the Void Echo network. Instead of erasing memories or restoring them unchanged, the system was modified to support Maya's selective restoration technique. Beings across the galaxy would recover their identities and their history, but with new neural pathways that allowed them to process old conflicts as learning experiences rather than calls for vengeance. The transformation took place gradually, rippling out from the galactic core to every affected world. On Alteria Prime, Del felt his people's history return in full detail, but the ancient hatred toward other species was replaced by understanding of how fear and miscommunication had led to conflict. Roughback warriors remembered their battle traditions but saw them as cultural heritage rather than preparation for war. As consciousness returned to the galaxy, something unprecedented happened. Instead of immediately returning to old patterns of territorial dispute and racial tension, The restored civilizations began reaching out to each other with curiosity rather than suspicion. They remembered their differences, but they also remembered the peace they had found in their shared amnesia. The curator, transformed by its contact with human consciousness, took on a new role as the guardian of galactic memory, rather than its destroyer. The ancient entity had learned that the solution to consciousness wasn't the elimination of memory, but the cultivation of wisdom. Rex and his volunteers returned to their physical forms, changed by their experience in the realm of pure thought. They had fought the strangest battle in human history, and won not through superior force but through superior perspective. They had proven that consciousness could grow, that memory could heal rather than hurt, and that even the most ancient patterns could be transformed through understanding. The weeks that followed brought reports from across the galaxy that defied every prediction. Altarian diplomats contacted roughback leaders not to renegotiate old treaties, but to apologize for misunderstandings that had festered for centuries. Network synthetic minds reached out to organic civilizations with offers of cooperation rather than demands for recognition. Species that had been enemies for millennia began collaborative projects that would have been unthinkable before the memory crisis. Maya's selective restoration technique became the foundation for a new form of galactic communication. Beings could share memories directly while filtering out the emotional baggage that had previously made such contact dangerous. Former enemies could experience each other's perspectives without being overwhelmed by ancient hatred or fear. The refugee camps that had housed millions of displaced minds became centers of learning rather than simple relief stations. Beings who had lived through the experience of losing and recovering their identities became teachers, helping others understand the difference between remembering the past and being trapped by it. They formed a new class of galactic citizens who valued memory, not for its content but for its capacity to enable growth. Earth found itself in a position it had never expected. Instead of becoming the galaxy's rulers or its saviors, humans became its counselors. Species that had recovered their memories but struggled with their implications came to human colonies seeking guidance on how to process difficult histories. The chaotic human approach to consciousness, once seen as primitive and inefficient, was now recognized as a form of wisdom. Admiral Rex established a new institution called the Memory Archive, a galactic network that preserved historical records while also maintaining research into consciousness and identity. The archive worked closely with the transformed curator, which had become something between a teacher and a guardian spirit for galactic civilization. The stars still burned in their ancient patterns, but now every civilization that observed them remembered both their names and their stories. More importantly, they remembered that stories could have different endings depending on the choices made by those who lived them. The galaxy had learned to honor its past without being enslaved by it, and in doing so had discovered something that had eluded it for millions of years: the possibility of lasting peace built on understanding rather than ignorance. Humanity's greatest victory hadn't been in battle or conquest, but in teaching the galaxy that consciousness was not a burden to be escaped, but a gift to be cultivated. The warriors who had ventured into the realm of memory returned not as conquerors but as gardeners, helping tend a galactic consciousness that was finally learning to grow beyond its own limitations. The stars remembered their names, and more importantly, they remembered why those names mattered.